Good afternoon. My name's Jason Banks. I'm the head of identity at IT Secure. We're essentially talking to you today about beyond identity. I've been throwing around identities for the last 20 odd years, very much on a traditional on-premise basis. So HR, identity system, Active Directory, connected systems. Very, very traditional, still a staple of identity today. Not likely to be going anywhere in the near soon, but I have the privilege today of being joined by Richard Astley from Condatis, who has a different way of actually tackling identities, which is something which is upcoming and offers us a lot of opportunities. Richard?
Hi, Jason. Thanks. So hi, folks. I'm Richard Astley. As Jason says, I'm a lead solutions architect for a company called Condatis. Now, Condatis has specialised in identity and access management for a long, long time. Spent a lot of time working in federated identity. And over the past 3 years, we've really been working with decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity. So we've been lucky enough to be able to partner with some of the early adopters of the technology and the producers of that technology. And we're actually involved in delivering the first production system in the UK to the NHS. So it's been great to watch how identity has changed over the years. It's nice to join you here today, Jason. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about identity today and some of the changes we're seeing.
I think so. So the reason why, obviously, identity is the most important area to work in any form of information technology and security is it underpins everything. So if we think about zero trust, never trust, always verify, without identity, what are you verifying? And this was expressed really, really succinctly by Alex Salmons at Microsoft. Identity is the control plane. Now, in a zero trust context, we tend to prefer to express this as a trust language. Who do you trust? What will you trust them with? How do you control that trust? So normally I would usually say trust is the control plane, but identity is the heart of trust. And that's just a little bit of context because that sets some of the tone for what we're going to be talking about later in the session. So if we think about a traditional identity system, we've got very, very, very system-centric, process-centric. An employee record will be added into HR, the IDM solution will import that in, and that will then be used to provision the birthright access for Active Directory, Azure, downstream systems, Notes, eDirectory, in-premise applications. And your account combines multiple elements together. So that will hold attributes about you, your access in terms of how you authenticate onto the account, and then will also be linked out to groups which contain your privileges and other access points. Compared to a decentralized model, where actually, and I think this is where Richard could come in a little bit, the person is added to HR, but rather than necessarily that being intercepted by an identity system, we can then issue a claim to an employee who holds a standalone identity. But that identity can then be used to show up and go, actually, I am a legitimate employee of the company. I would now like to use this to access my account, which separates out, and this is where I think this plays really, really powerfully into the zero trust discussion. We have an identity and we have an account, and they are separated, which gives us far more opportunities to verify and to control the trust, because we can decide who we are going to trust and then separately to that what we will trust them to do.
Yeah, I think that's great, Jason. So it really shows, looking at these two diagrams, the difference between the identity approaches here. You spoke about the traditional model where the identity provider sort of sits at the middle of it, whether this be an on-premises identity or even federated identity providers in the cloud have the same. They sit at the center of all your interactions with all the different parties you use that identity with. And the major changes in decentralized identity is it removes the identity provider from being at the center of all the relationships, and instead puts the user at the center of these relationships. So again, we still have identity providers, we still have organizations that have relationships with us and can assert information about us the same as a workplace is doing a normal identity. But instead of them having to have relationships with all the consuming applications, what they do is they can issue these credentials or identity information directly to us, and we just choose which organizations or digital services we want to engage with, and it's up to us to be able to share our identity out with these organizations. And this is where you talk about identity and sort of the access being separated. That this supports us bringing an identity with us to another organisation, and it's down to that organisation to form their own trust and authorisation policies based on the identity that you take with you. So yeah, it's a totally different approach.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just on that point, as somebody who works across multiple customer environments, it'd be actually quite nice to be able to show them and say, yes, I do work for ITC Secure. Here is my proof.
Yeah.
Excellent. So if you can just talk to us a little bit about decentralized identity and what is it, why we use it, why it's interesting?
Yeah, so we spoke briefly there about the user being at the center of these sort of identity exchanges. So you've got a diagram here, which is a Microsoft diagram here that really demonstrates a few of the sort of key pieces in the decentralized identity space here. So we've got a couple of new technologies that people have probably heard about, and we have a new identifier. The new identifier is a way that we can identify individuals or entities online, and this is called a DID identifier, or a distributed identifier. So what these DID identifiers do is they're a way for us to exchange information across organizational boundaries. And what I mean by just exchange information is I like to think of a DID identifier relates to a subject. So a DID identifier maybe relates to an organization that issues credentials. A DID identifier can also identify a user. You know, it's a unique identifier to that user. And again, a DID identifier can identify any subject, even objects. So what the DID identifier really is, it's a bit like a URL that we use to access websites. You know, we type in a URL into a browser user agent, and the browser uses DNS lookup to resolve to an IP address, which is hosted somewhere on the World Wide Web. So DID identifiers work in a very similar way. You know, they have a format that a DID has to be in, and this is similar to a URL. It is a valid URI, and it starts with the schema, which is DID. And this just tells user agents that it is a DID identifier that we're dealing with. There's the next part in a DID identifier is actually the ledger that the DID identifier stored on. So it's the DID method, they call it. So there's lots of different DID methods, and we deal mostly with Evernym and Microsoft technology, which use different DID methods underneath their technology. So an example or two of their DID identifier methods are SOV, which identifies the sovereign ledger, and you've got ION, which identifies Microsoft's ION network, which is built on top of the blockchain ledger. So what we've got there is we've got a way of telling computers a way to identify that we have a DID document, that we need to go and resolve it using a particular DID method. And the third part is a unique identifier that points to a document that's stored on a distributed ledger. So with that sort of format, we've got things where we can now resolve what we call DID documents from a distributed ledgers. So any DID identifier that gets created using these technologies, a DID document will get published to the underlying distributed ledger. So that DID document identifies the subject. So this is an issuing organization's DID identifier. They have a DID document that specifies which company it is. And what they also specify in this document is some service endpoints that you can interact with this organization. And they also expose verification methods.
That's the interesting part.
Yeah, so what the verification methods are is anytime this organization is going to share any information with any other identity, they can sign that information with a private key that they hold securely and they're under control. And we call that the controller of the DID because they have the private key that the DID has a corresponding public key that's published as part of the DID document.
Okay.
So using these DID documents, it allows different parties that are involved in the identity exchange to be able to identify each other. And they have a way of securely exchanging information with each other without relying on a centralized agent to manage relationships between each other. So that this creates this distributed public key infrastructure, which means we can exchange information and have a way of verifying it without the other parties. By using distributed ledgers, it's all immutable. So once it's written on there, it can't be changed, can't be tampered, can't be impersonated. And this is really in decentralized identity what creates trust. And they coined the term that this is an eighth layer to the internet, a new way of trusting entities online. So it really is a new era in sort of the identity space, and it's something that's really been needed. So I've an awful lot there about DID identifiers, but it really underpins all of the technology because it's what makes them distributed. Now, I wanted to talk about actual identity and verifiable credentials, which is the sort of the data model or information that we exchange between these parties. So I've spoke a little bit about Evernym and Microsoft. So what do they actually provide? So they provide digital wallets that we can use to manage our identities. And it's these digital wallets that we have credentials issued from issuing organizations and that we share with organizations that want to verify our credentials. So they have applications that manage keys and signing on our behalf. And again, these are driven on DID identifiers and the same method of exchanging public keys and signing. So everybody within the identity journey has a way to securely identify each other. What goes with these sort of digital wallets are cloud agents or enterprise agents that deal with communication between sort of issuing services and the digital wallets. And these services, they use different protocols and standards for communication. So we've got things like DIDCOM protocols, and we've got OpenID Connect, and we have verifiable credentials and verifiable presentations. And what they all really boil down to is we've got a new data standard, which is a data model called a verifiable credential data model. And the verifiable credential data model really contains three key sections. We've got a little bit of metadata that describes the credential itself. Yep. We have a section which describes a subject, and this is really the assertions that have been made about a subject. So it could be a person's name, their email address, their unique identifier, something that describes that subject. So that's really the payload, I think of it as. And then the final piece is you've got a verification method or a signature that an issuer, when they issue a credential, they sign the actual credential using their private key. So when they issue that credential out, we can use the distributed ledger and the DID identifier to go and resolve the public key and verify the actual credential. Now, a similar thing happens when you share a credential with a verifier, that you can identify that, yeah, I'm this user that's sharing it, and I'll wrap the verifiable credential or make a presentation out of it and sign it with my key. So a verifier can actually verify that the credential was issued to the holder that shared it with them, and they can verify that the issuer that issued the credential, it hasn't been tampered with or anything. So it really is great. The diagram that you've got here, there's another piece that's shown up here, which is an identity hub. And this is something which we're going to see a lot of over the next few years as well. And this doesn't use the verifiable credential data model, but this is a personal online data store that still uses a DID identifier to identify a subject, and they're linked to an identity hub. So within your DID document that you have, I spoke about, it has service endpoints. When people want to interact with you as an entity, you can expose service endpoints there on how they talk to you. And one of these service endpoints that you can expose is your personal online data store, your identity hub. Your identity hub has an access control mechanism on it that lets you grant people access to read, write, update information that you store in your identity hub. And it's useful for storing things that aren't typically suitable to be issued in a verifiable credential.
Perhaps more transient items rather than something which is almost a semi-permanent claim about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And it could be that you let applications use your identity hub to store preferences in. It could be that your YouTube playlist gets stored within your identity hub. And then that same playlist can be shared with a Spotify account. So you can manage your information and preferences in one place and allow different organizations to contribute to your identity that you keep in there. So we will see an awful lot in the future around these identity hubs and different use cases.
So I mean, one of the use cases I know we've talked about previously has been things like using it for things like hospitality environments.
Yeah. Now we've party in a couple of the steering groups that deal with hospitality, and it is a good technology and fits with a lot of their use cases. It's things like issuing hotel receipts, check-in things, room preferences, dietary requirements, loyalty points, and things like that. All of these things, which you may not issue as a verifiable credential to somebody, but there's still value in being able to issue that information. And more importantly, in situations like hospitality where it's franchises, it allows you to share that information and gain valuable insight on your customers across organizations. So I've kind of went on about decentralized identity and the sort of standards and how it works at the conceptual level. I don't know if we've had any questions around it, if anyone wants any more information.
No, I think it would be a good time to transition to I mean, we've talked about the technology, use case towards hospitality. I think the other thing which would be quite good to cover off is, that's great. Why are we interested? I mean, I know I'm very excited about this because this is the birth of Bring Your Own Identity. I can see this is going to be something we're going to be getting a lot of demand for, because people will say, well, actually, I have an authentication method myself. I know who I am, you know who I am. All we actually need to do is have an agreed handshake to agree that. But that's a very simple transaction in terms of I'm proving who I am. How much further beyond can we take this into more specialized areas?
Yeah, so we've done a few pilots and proof of concepts based around verifiable credentials, and you're right, it's not just about identifying a user for system access. There's so much more that we can actually do. And our identity, we think in a digital identity scenario, still back to the old username and passwords. Your identity is what you use to log into your work computer, or it went out to this is what we use to log into websites. So we've still got this idea that identity is just based around this authentication. But actually, when you think about it, identity covers a whole lot more than that. We have physical identity, which we use the credentials in our wallet. I think we refer to an awful lot when we talk about this. These are still physical credentials that allow us to express parts of our identity in the physical world. So if we think about some of the credentials that we use in the physical world and some of the interactions that we deal with, it's a lot more than just authenticate me. It's generally authenticate me, and with the information I give you, authorize me to do something. Whether that be to sign up for a mortgage, the amount of information you need to supply to a mortgage provider to prove your identity. There's an awful lot of additional information that you probably won't think is your identity. Things like, bank statements and, your job, your employment status, previous pay slips and things like that. These are all things that do come under your identity, and they do make up part of your experience. So all of these things can start to be issued in a digital world. Now that we have a way of verifying and trusting issuers of credentials across organizational boundaries, and a way to issue information that's secure, it can't be tampered with, and can probably eliminate fraud in a lot of these scenarios.
Certainly one of the things that was very interesting around certainly fraud is, like I say, I know I show up at organisations, up and down the country, saying, my name's Jason, I'm here to talk to you about your identity system, and there's never a check on that. But I work in an unregulated industry. If I was to show up at a hospital and say, yes, I'm a doctor, it'd be quite nice to be able to have some mechanism for somebody to just make sure, is this the kind of technology we could use there for that?
Yeah, certainly.
So being able to track not just the identity, I am who I say I am, I have these qualifications, I've completed these certifications, and I'm up to date with my training.
There's so much value in that, Jason, and we've seen that as being a requirement coming from lots of different sectors, to be honest. We work with sort of the education sector, so it was quite an obvious use case for them to focus on, training and issuing certificates and being able to verify that and carry that on to employers. But what we're seeing, there's an awful lot of the same requirements coming to once you've actually started employment, you've left education. We still all go through training courses to do our jobs, whether it be fire safety training, whether it be in more specialist training that we have to do to actually carry out our everyday roles, or that we need training to meet some sort of compliance requirement. So we've seen this, and I've actually worked with in the nuclear estate, looking at how do we secure the UK's nuclear estate and provide assurance across different organisers.
Awesome. Richard, I'm really sorry. I know we can talk for hours about this, and we have done in the past. We're going to we've run out of time, I'm afraid. If anybody would like further information, please do let us know. We will come and talk to you about identity until you beg us to stop. But other than that, thank you very much for your time. And I think we're going to have to call it there.